Thanks for coming out today. We really appreciate the attendance we have. It seems like the program every year is growing more and more. So I'm really happy to see such a good turnout. When I sat down at the beginning of the year to determine what I wanted the theme of 2012 to be, I really focused on the idea that there's a lack of science education as part of welding programs in the United States. And I travel around a lot, and I talk to a lot of schools and school districts about different topics concerning welding education. That's part of my job. That's really the part of the job that I enjoy the most. And so when we came up with the idea of making science the theme of this year, and I started to do a little bit of research into some of the data that's available out there, it made me very concerned about some of the choices we're making in education. And that's why I think this is a great topic to kick off today and this part of the program with. The topic for my presentation today is teaching the science of welding. We've just gone through a very exuberant presidential campaign. And it seemed like throughout the campaign there was one topic that kept being brought up over and over and over, whether it's in the debate or in the news, and that's jobs. And in the welding industry, this is something that we're very concerned with, especially with the unemployment rate at the level that it's at. We're seeing during the last 4 years an unprecedented recession. And it's caused an industry such as welding, which has had so many opportunities for welders historically for the last 100 years, to really have a hard time finding qualified workers, finding people. There's a lot of welders out of work. And it goes against many of the foundations of this industry. This is a picture of the Bay Bridge. Why did I put this up here today? It's simple. With the amount of unemployed welders in the United States that we have today, with the amount of welders that are looking for good quality work, the Bay Bridge extension in San Francisco is being welded in China. It's being welded in China because we couldn't find qualified welders in San Francisco to weld the bridge there. So the pieces are being welded in China, shipped in parts to the United States and assembled here. The problem was that when the first batch of shipments came over in late 2009, they started to crack. And we had to send them back to be rewelded. Then we had to send American inspectors over to China to inspect the work of the Chinese welders. And so now we have this issue where you're looking at both a great level of unemployment in this country and an inability to find qualified welders. There's several reasons for this, but I'm going to focus on two. One is globalization. It's the reality of the world today. We're becoming a global world. It's now cheaper to build things in other countries and ship them to the United States than it is to build them in the United States. It's the reality of global politics. It's the reality of global economics. There's nothing that anyone can do to fight this. Don't let anyone tell you anything differently. The other problem is this. This is a chart of manufacturing in this country. The percentage of employment back in 1980 was 22.5% of people in the United States were employed in manufacturing. In 2010, we're at about 10%, a little bit over 10%. We've been shipping over the last 30 years more and more manufacturing outside of the United States. In 1972, like I said, 23.9% of all jobs in this country were manufacturing jobs. The second largest was government, then you went into wholesale and trade. Right now, the makeup in 2010 of manufacturing jobs is about 9%, down here. What's even more concerning is this. This is the unemployment rate that you see talked about in the news, but it's broken up slightly differently. Now, here it's broken up by the type of job that one has. White-collar jobs have the lowest unemployment rate in 2012, with about 6%. White-collar jobs are people who sit behind a desk, work in an office. Service jobs have an unemployment rate of about 9% there. But when you look at blue-collar, you're looking at over 10% of unemployment. So it's disproportional, this unemployment rate that you see. More blue-collar workers, more manufacturing workers, more factory workers are out of jobs, out of the traditional jobs that made this country, and we have more and more white-collar workers. This is compounded by the fact that every year we have about 50,000 welders retiring from the welding industry, but we only have about 25,000 new students entering welding programs. That means in the next 10 years, AWS is estimating there's going to be about 200,000 open welding positions in this country that we will not be able to fill. So we're going to have basically a shortage of 200,000 welders in the US. And like I said before, those facts don't match what you're seeing in the job market right now. Take a look at any of the employment reports put out by the US government, and what you're going to see is hundreds of thousands of manufacturing, of welding jobs open right now that are not being filled. For example, right now, as of August, which is the last report that I was able to pull up when I made this presentation, there were about 255,000 manufacturing jobs, about 82,000 construction jobs. Okay? Not all of these are welding positions, obviously, but a good portion are. So there's a big gap. Okay, there's a gap between the fact that there are all these open positions and we have all these welders that are out of work. And so the question that I kept asking myself was why? Why is there this gap? Why is this occurring in our industry? I looked at two surveys. The first survey told me this. They've surveyed manufacturers, and they said that 81% of manufacturers can't find skilled workers. The second thing that that same survey said, that of all manufacturers, reject at least half of all applications for people that are looking for jobs. Then I came upon this survey. The Manufacturing Institute and Deloitte Accounting did a massive survey across the United States of about 5,000 manufacturers. And they asked a whole bunch of different questions to these manufacturers, but the one that really caught my attention was this question. What are the most serious skill deficiencies in current employees? So let's forget about the fact that we're trying to hire people. Right now in the current workforce, what are the biggest deficiencies? Number one answer, 51% of manufacturers answered that the number one problem in the current workforce, 52%, is a lack of problem-solving skills, an inability to think. While my workforce is great at producing A, B, and C, they cannot do anything but produce A, B, and C. Number two, lack of basic training. The people that are graduating our programs today are not graduating with the skills and with the knowledge necessary to make them competitive in the 21st century marketplace. It's as simple as that. Number three, an inability to use technology. Number four, inadequate math skills. That one was kind of a surprise for me. So I delved a little bit deeper into this, and I'm just showing you a couple of quick charts, and I won't spend a lot of time on this. But they asked, which employee segment has workforce shortages or skill deficiencies? So which area, what type of jobs specifically in manufacturing are the ones that need the most amount of help? They are showing the greatest deficiencies. The number one, 74% of responders said that they're skilled production, machinists, operators, craft workers, distributors, technicians, have serious skill deficiencies. They went on to say, what do you do to mitigate this? What do you do to help fix this problem? 83% of them said we have to have internal training and development programs. The schools are not producing the workers with the skills and knowledge we need, so we are having to spend the time and the money to develop them ourselves. Now this starts to paint a little bit of a clearer picture. Think about this from the perspective of a shop owner. If I had to hire an American worker who I then had to spend thousands and thousands of dollars and man hours training, or if I can outsource this to somewhere else where they already have the skills and knowledge that they need to produce what I need them to produce at the level that I need them to produce it, Which are you going to choose? It's a very simple economic decision. The last chart I wanted to show was this. This shows the availability of qualified workers and the deficiency of those workers in any given segment. Right now, overall, the greatest shortage, okay, that you're going to see, which is this 45% right here, is in skilled production, is in skilled labor. It's people who have the ability to craft something. 45% of manufacturers are saying that they have a serious shortage. If you want to add that with the moderate shortage of 38%, you're looking at almost everyone in the industry. In 2009, 2010, AWS released a report called Division of Welding Industry that looked at welding through 2020. Okay, and one of the things that they pointed out, and part of the report that I always talk about in my presentations is this. It said that until recently, welding itself was a skill craft people could learn without a real understanding of the science behind it. But by 2020, the scientific and engineering principles behind welding must replace the art of welding for it to achieve its potential as a preferred state-of-the-art manufacturing process. This is a great sentence, if you think about it. By 2020, the scientific and engineering principles of science have to replace the art of welding. Why? Why is that necessary in this industry? That's really what part of this presentation is about. It's understanding why it's important that we teach science, why it's important to create a smarter, better welder. That's not the biggest problem, though. And I wish I was the bearer of better news. But this problem doesn't exist just in the welding industry. And I don't want you to think as educators that you or I are responsible for this ourselves. This is something that's occurring across the entire United States. The National Center for Educational Statistics does a survey every few years. The last one they did was in 2009, where they assess students' progression in science at 4 levels, at 4th grade, 8th grade, and 12th grade. And the way they do it is they rate those students as either proficient, meaning that they understand a level of science that is appropriate for someone at their age. Okay, for example, someone who could explain to me in 8th grade how lightning is formed. There's an advanced. This is someone who is beyond what you would typically see someone of that age level understanding about science. This is someone who not only understands how electricity works in 8th grade, but someone who could build a science fair project that shows you how electricity works. And there's basic. Those are the kids that still think that Zeus creates lightning. In 4th grade, 72% of all students in the United States met the basic level. Okay, that still means that you have 28% of students who did not. In 8th grade, that number drops to 63%. By 12th grade, it drops to 60%. This is basic level. This means that you are operating at several grade levels below the grade that you're in. An 8th grader with a 6th grader understanding of science. This gets even more depressing as you go further on. Proficient, which means you meet your grade level. 34% of students in the United States. In 4th grade, 30% in 8th grade, 21% by the time that they get ready to graduate. And if we look at the advanced level, 1%, 2%, 1%. So we are a country who is scientifically illiterate, producing a student and a worker in a world that is now being governed by science and technology that is scientifically illiterate. But it's not just the students. See, one of the things I love about this survey is that it's not biased. Not only does it test the 4th graders, the 8th graders, and the 12th graders, but it also tests a random sampling of adults. And this is what the survey found. It asked them simple science questions, ranging from questions you would see in a 4th grader classroom, questions you see in an 8th grade classroom, and questions you see in a 12th grade classroom. So they asked them a fourth grade question. They said, okay, you own a farm. And on that farm, you have some crops. And those crops are dying. And you realize that they're dying because they need to be watered more. Is it a good idea that you take water from the ocean and use it to irrigate your crops? 16% of adults said, yes, that's a really good idea. They asked an 8th grade question. True or false? So really, there's a 50-50 shot at this point. True or false? An electron is larger than an atom. 49% of adults got this wrong. And this is my favorite. 56% of adults could not explain why you see lightning before you hear thunder. These are about the most basic science questions you can ask someone. These are adults who have graduated high school, who are unable to share even the most basic scientific information. I was sharing this with some of the members of my team last night because this chart is really disturbing to me. This shows the number of nations, okay, that are surveyed under the same surveys that perform better, the same, and worse than the United States. So in fourth grade, we're actually really great. There's only a couple of nations that perform better than us. There's a few nations that perform the same, and most nations in the United States in 4th grade perform worse than the United States. So that's a really good result. But what you start seeing as they progress down through school is this. More nations are the same in 8th grade, and a much greater percentage are better than the United States. By the time you hit 12th grade, we've been left in the dust. So when I see statistics like this, I have to ask why? What is it that our 4th graders are getting that our kids that are graduating high school are not? And this is a very important chart. I'm not here to preach to you as science or math teachers. But the truth of the matter is, where are you getting your students from? It's not here. It's here. That's where you're getting your students from. By the time they reach you, they're illiterate. They're scientifically illiterate. So the question is this. I keep using that phrase, scientifically illiterate. What does that mean? Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is an astrophysicist, and he runs the Hayden Planetarium in New York. He's also a professor and a lecturer on the importance of science education in the United States. And one of my heroes said that, he says the center line of scientific literacy is how you think. He goes on to say, it's not about whether you know what an atom is, or whether you can tell me what this element is, or what that element is, or whether you can read a periodic table. The center line, scientific literacy, is all about a person's ability to think scientifically. What do we mean by that? Everyone's seen this as an educator. It's Bloom's taxonomy. You know, it changes, people make new pyramids, they change the colors, they change the names, but it's always the same. The idea is simple. There are higher level thinking skills, there are lower level thinking skills. Most welding programs spend a large portion of their time, I would go as far as saying 85 to 90% of their time, doing what? Physical skills. Why? It's important. You can't have a welder who can't weld. It's that simple. You know, I'm not blind to this idea. A welder who cannot produce a weld is of no use to the industry. So yes, they have to learn the physical skills of welding. But what about the rest? How do we train both the body and the mind of the welder? There's several things I want to talk about today. So one, the F word. One of my favorite words. Failure. Failure is an essential component of the education process. Think of it this way. Think about the last time you had to learn something, a physical skill. Take the guitar. I hand everyone today a guitar. And I say, go home for 2 weeks. You're going to learn how to play the guitar. Okay? Your wife and children will not like me. Why? Because it's going to be terrible. It's going to sound pretty much what my hell is going to sound like. But eventually, after enough failure, after trying enough things and not having them work, you're going to be able to play, and you're going to be able to play well. And all that failure, the fact that you tried different things, that they didn't work, is what's going to lead to that success. Learning, education, is a process of failure. Unfortunately, we teach students not to fail. Failure in school is very well defined. Students that fail get Fs. They don't move on. It's that simple. It ignores the cycle of student learning. Look, it's very simple. Students learn in a very simple pattern. You present a new problem, a challenge. They have to explore options of how to fix that challenge, how to solve that challenge, how to meet that challenge. They have to be innovative. They have to invent. They have to find ways of solving that issue. Then they have to apply it in the classroom. That's how students actually learn. But that's not how we do most learning in the classroom. Okay? We ignore that discovery. Okay? Failure is not the end of a lesson. It's the beginning. 2, experimentation. And this is going to touch very heavily upon that first, point of failure. Go back to think about what Neil deGrasse Tyson said. Look, science literacy is about how we think. So how do you teach students to think in a classroom? Well, the way that our classrooms are set up right now, we use things like systematic instruction and scripted lessons. We call this curriculum. How many people in here have lesson plans that they follow in their classroom or have guidelines that they follow? Okay, I'd say I'd venture, because most of you are nodding your heads up and down, that yes, this is something that everyone does. And part of what lesson planning does is that it scripts the classroom experience. Okay, it says, at this point I'm going to cover this, then I'm going to cover this, then I'm going to cover this, then I'm going to cover this. What point in that lesson is the student's time? At what point in that lesson are we allowing the students to run the class? Are we allowing the students to dictate what they need? It's never considered. The way the standardized education works in the United States right now is we move everyone at the same speed. We move everyone at the same level. Okay? The model of standardized education in the United States is built on a factory. Okay? Because when we had the public education system developed in our country, it was to build a smarter workforce. It ignores the ability of a student to experiment. Okay? Experimentation works on a very simple cycle. The idea that I'm going to observe something, I'm going to build the theory as to how that observation works, and then I'm going to have an opportunity to apply it and then predict its behavior. How is this important in welding? It's very simple. We often tell students, this is how you produce this weld. Okay? Watch me do it. Notice these and these and these things. Now you do it. No, you've done it wrong. Do it again. We've eliminated the possibility of that student failing. If that student fails, it's because they were unable to follow your instructions. But at what point do they learn there? At what point do they have the ability to ask a question as to why that has occurred? At what point do they have the ability to fix a problem that occurs? All those things have been stripped out of the education system. We've ignored the ability or the need to experiment in the classroom. And this is one of the big issues as to why I think you have a problem with between 4th, 8th, and 12th graders where everything starts to slope downward. Look, science is key to education. This is a word search where we created a word web of the word education. More than half those words deal with science. Education and science are linked. Yet we remove that scientific process, the ability to experiment, the ability to create direct meaning from something by having the direct experience. This is a model of how experimentation works, and it's very simple, and I don't want to spend a lot of time on it. But basically the idea is we see something, we create a hypothesis of how it works. We predict what behavior is going to be, we test it out. Anyone who knows anything about science will tell you 90% of the time that's going to fail. And then we come back here and we say, okay, let's predict something else. Let's create a new hypothesis. Let's try that one out. until we figure out exactly how to solve the problem. It goes back to the guitar. It goes back to the idea of failure. The scientific process cannot happen without that failure. One of the keys to this, though, is not just that we have to give students the ability to fail, but we have to give them the ability to fail without the fear of failure. See, because students can fail right now, but when they fail, they usually have to take the paper home and get it signed by mom and dad, instead of giving them the opportunity to fix that failure. 3, the ability to ask why. I'll tell a very quick story. This is my daughter, Ella. She comes home one day. She wants to be a scientist when she grows up, she says, which makes me very, very happy. A scientist and a ballerina and a teacher and a mom, she said. She comes home one day and she says, "You want to know what I learned about today in science?" I said, "What? Tell me." She goes, "I learned about volcanoes." I was like, "Cool, volcanoes are awesome. I love volcanoes." And I said, "What's a volcano?" And she says, "A volcano is a mountain that makes magma." Well, aside from the fact that a volcano does not make magma, we're going to ignore that and we're going to say, "Okay, well, tell me a little bit more about volcanoes." And she's like, "A volcano is a mountain that makes magma." I said, "Well, did you see a video of a volcano? Did you see pictures of volcanoes? Did you see any of that stuff? You know, did you look at it? Did you get to experience it? Did you see a diagram? Do you know how it works?" No. A volcano is a mountain that makes magma. I was very confused by this. I didn't really get why a teacher would take something as fun as a volcano, as interesting as a volcano, and make her learn that a volcano is a mountain that makes magma, without ever showing her a picture of a volcano. And I said, "Hey, do you want to see a picture of a volcano? Do you want to see videos?" We spent the next hour and a half jumping from video to video on YouTube, looking at diagrams, and she was asking me questions. Well, where does the magma come from? What is magma? And it was a natural curiosity of a child. I want to also point out that she goes to a charter school that's rated #1 in our county for science. So it's not as though she went to a bad school or had a bad teacher. She's also in the advanced program. And I couldn't figure it out. And my wife said, "You're being stupid, David. It's very simple, the answer. Teacher doesn't care if she knows what a volcano is. She cares if she can answer it correctly on the test." 4. And it kind of ties into 3 a little bit there. It has to do with motivation. How are we motivating our students to learn the science of what we're talking about? Look, I've spent a long time talking about education, talking to many thousands of teachers around the United States. And really, I think all educational ills, every problem that we have in education, boils down to one simple thing. And again, this is my opinion. People can disagree with me. But I think that everything that occurs in education, all the problems we have, regardless of which level it is, boils down to one simple problem. School is boring. How do I know this? Because I don't want to go back to school. If you gave me the option, you say, "I will pay for you to go and get a PhD. I will pay, and I will pay you to be a student. Your same salary that you're making now at AWS. And all you'd have to do is take a couple classes a day." I still wouldn't do it. How many of us would voluntarily go back into a classroom to learn? It's not very fun. You know, sure, I'm sure there's outliers out there, but it's not very fun, and it's not very fun for students. And the funny thing about it is the science is so damn interesting. It is fun. How many people took chemistry in high school and had to learn this? I had to take a test on this, where this was empty, and I had to fill this out. This is how we were taught chemistry. This is not chemistry. This is the periodic table that exists on any book, that exists on my smartphone, that I can bring up in 5 seconds anywhere in the world. There's no need for me to ever memorize this. This is not chemistry. That's boring. This is chemistry. This is what we should be teaching in class. We should be looking at chemistry in the practical way. And yes, this is a joke, this is fun. But I guarantee you that no one in here can explain to me why when you put a Mentos into a Diet Coke, it explodes. And that is the baseline of chemistry. Look, take something different. Take something that applies to welding. Newton's second law of motion. Every body persists in a state of being at rest or of moving uniformly straight forward, except insofar as it is compelled to change its state by force impressed. I had to memorize this. I had to regurgitate it for a test. I always laugh because anyone who reads this is not going to really understand, or they may understand it after reading it several times, and really they're still not going to get a clear picture of what Newton was talking about. I could teach this to a fourth grader. I could teach this to a fourth grader with this simple 20-second clip. This, ladies and gentlemen, is Newton's second law of motion. Many times, however, we take away the majesty, the interest in science. Look, when we landed on the moon, it was on the front page of every newspaper around the world. Okay? It was the height of scientific discovery of this country. It was a moment of pride in America. You couldn't turn on a TV show, you couldn't pick up a newspaper or a magazine without seeing these images. Earlier this year, scientists at CERN discovered the Higgs Boson, essentially completing the standard model of physics, producing the greatest understanding, the most complete understanding of how every part of our universe functions. Okay? Leading mankind into an avenue, an area of science that we never thought was possible. I found this in a newspaper in like page 12. I remember sitting down with my dad one day to have a beer, and we're talking about this. And I told him, it's amazing to me how many people don't know that this has happened. But then it's true. Go back over the last 30 years. Look at all the great advancements in science and how, in many ways, it's been ignored. But the truth of the matter is that regardless of how illiterate our current society may be, science and math are the new currency. The workers of tomorrow are not only going to have to be scientifically literate, but they're going to have that ability to think if they want to succeed in this marketplace. Those lower level skills are still very important. But we can't produce the welder of tomorrow just looking at the stuff that's down here. We also have to look at the top of that pyramid. It's simple economics. You can't compete. If other countries are producing smarter, better welders, no matter how good they can lay down that bead, they're never going to be able to compete in today's marketplace. Think of it this way. A welder can produce great welds, and a welder can be really good at his job. But no matter how good that welder is, there's always going to be someone better. They can produce it faster and more consistent, who doesn't need vacation time, who doesn't need breaks, and who doesn't need to work in 8-hour shifts. And what separates us from the machines is our ability to think. And if the machines ever get to the point where they can think, we're in much bigger trouble than we are right now. The modern welder is a smart welder. The welding of tomorrow, the welding that's going on today in this nation, is not the same welding that was occurring 50 years ago. Okay? We need welders who have the ability to think, to adapt. So what can you do as teachers? Okay, we already talked about some of the things that we need to change as far as attitude and philosophy. Here are some practical things you can take back to your classroom tomorrow and use. The first one is integration. One of the things that drives me the most crazy about this is that you'll see people that always come to me and say, oh, Dave, I really liked your presentation. I really liked what you said about science. We cover science also. And I say, okay, how's it integrated into your classroom? Well, once a week we talk about, some science stuff. We talk about what an arc is, or we talk about this, or we talk about that. And I said, so you basically break it out. It's a different part of your class. And what do you think that's telling your students? We have to integrate science into every part of what we do in the classroom. It's not something separate. The science of welding is not separate than the skill of welding. It's the same thing. In one, you're training the body, you're training the hands. In the other, you're training the mind. They need to be trained together. Here's some things you could do. When you're talking about welding, when you're explaining welding to them, don't just go in so far as saying, hey, when you strike an arc, the arc is made of plasma. That's great. Why aren't we talking about what plasma is? Why aren't we showing them plasma? Why aren't we showing them the properties of how plasma acts? Why is it plasma? Why isn't it just fire? Why do we use that? What is plasma? I guarantee you go to most middle schools in this nation, they're going to tell you there are 3 states of matter. Solid, gas, liquid. When my daughter came home and told me there were 3 states of matter, I wrote a letter to the school. I said, no, they're not. There's a 4th one. It's called plasma. And my wife got all mad at me because she's like, oh, but kids that age can't understand it. And I called my daughter over and I said, Ella, listen to me. There are 3 states of matter, right? There's liquid, there's solid, there's gas. What's electricity? What's lightning? I don't know. It doesn't really fit into any of those. That's right, because there's a 4th one. It's called plasma. Oh, I get it. It's that simple. But teaching those very fundamentals of science, it's what's going to get them thinking about things, because it leads to questions. Okay? When I went into my daughter's school to do a presentation on welding, I didn't just go in there and talk about plasma. I brought in a plasma ball. I let them play with it. All of a sudden, those kids wanted to know everything there was to know about plasma. It became a science class instead of a career fair. Because it was something that they could see, that they could hold, that they could touch. Instead of just talking about electrical theory in schools, build circuits. Apply the knowledge of how electrical theory works. Now, why would welders need to know how to build circuits? It's not something that you would typically see as part of a welding curriculum. Yet, go to any engineering school in this nation, and they'll tell you that the best way to explain how electricity functions is by having students build circuits. Build circuits without resistances, build circuits with resistances, with switches, and understand the properties of how electricity works. Anyone remember having to do this? I had to do this in 10th grade. It was part of my science class. The whole point of it was you had to take these toothpicks or these little wooden sticks, and we all had to design and build a bridge. None of us were engineers. None of us had any idea how to do any of this stuff. Back then, there was not a whole lot of access to the internet. And we were told, hey, you got to build a bridge. But here's the fun thing. We're going to put those bridges inside of a press in the school, and we're going to see whose bridge can resist the most amount of force. This is how we learned about stresses. This is how we learned about how stresses move in an object. Because they would continue to add weight to your bridge until it cracked, and then you looked at where it cracked. And then in my school, they made it into a competition. And every kid wanted to be the one that had the bridge that can hold the most amount of weight, that can hold up the most amount of force. How many of you use WPSs in your classroom? How many of you ask your students to write their own? So we went from about 60 to 70% to about 4 in this room. It's one thing when I give you the instructions on how to do something. It's another when I ask you to create the instructions yourselves. Everyone's heard that old adage, and there's no scientific basis for it, but that you remember only 20% of what you hear, but you remember 40% of what you see and all that stuff, but you remember 90% of what you teach. I really do believe that you remember a great deal more of what you're able to teach than what you're able to just see or read or hear. Because you have to understand something enough to be able to teach it. It's the same principle with the WPS. You have to understand welding and what is occurring on a much higher level to be able to write a WPS than you do just to read it and to set a machine. Competitions. Okay, I'm a big supporter of the Skills USA competitions, of the welding competitions you see around the United States. One of the things we're doing on American Welding Online right now is we're asking teachers that when they have welding competitions to send us videos, send us pictures, and we'll release it through our mediums to help promote the kids, to show the winners, to show them what they're doing, to get other kids inspired and excited about these competitions. But I always feel like that competition needs to have a different aspect to it also. It can't just be about who produces the best weld. It needs to also be about who understands welding the most. Have there be a written portion to it. And many competitions already do this. Have a written theory portion, a knowledge portion of it. So it's not just who produces the best bead, but who understands welding the most also. Take it a step further. Look, in many of these competitions, you bring in people who are experts, CWIs, to inspect the welds, to judge it. But how much of that time do we let the kids inspect their own welds or each other's welds? How are they going to understand the difference between what makes a good weld and a bad weld if they've never seen it? If they've never touched it, if they've never had to look at it, if they don't understand why it's a good weld or why it's a bad weld. So I'm about done here. I want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. Neil deGrasse Tyson said, the best educators are the ones that inspire their students. That inspiration comes from a passion that teachers have for the subjects they're teaching. Most commonly, that person spends their life studying that subject, and they bring an infectious enthusiasm to the audience. I truly believe this. This is why I get excited about talking about science, because I feel like I love the topics of science. I'm fascinated by the world we see around us. But that also has to be you. It's easy to talk about welding in a theoretical term, and since we do it so often, we kind of lose a little bit of that. But I made a joke yesterday in one of the presentations I was making. I said, look, when I went into that career fair, those kids were eating out of my hands. Every kid walked out of there, didn't want to be a lawyer, didn't want to be a doctor. They wanted to be welders. Why? It's a simple sell. I'm telling the kids, you can cut metal with fire. You can melt metal with electricity. What kid's not going to want to play with that? It's just simple. I mean, guys, I'm basically giving you a race car and telling you to go drive at 4 years old, it's a very simple sell, okay, to people. But we do it every day. You forget about how amazing that technology that you hold in your hands is. The advancements of science that have occurred over the last 6,000 years, from the beginnings of welding to where we are now. We forget this because we see it every single day. Welding is cool, right? It's not a dirty job. It's not a job for stupid people. Welding is cool. So when we look at science in the classroom, when we talk about bringing all that stuff in, when we talk about bringing back the excitement, I want to leave you with this one thought. And it's probably one of my favorite quotes, and it's something that when I read it years ago really changed my perspective on a lot of things. Neil deGrasse Tyson, in The Sky's Not the Limit, which is his autobiography, said, "We fail at even the simplest of all scientific observations. Nobody looks up anymore." When was the last time you guys walked outside at night and looked up? If you take nothing out of this presentation, if you take nothing out of this week, do that. As silly as it sounds, as childish as it may sound, when you go home, wherever your home is, walk out on a clear night and look up. And remind yourself that we live in an incredibly amazing world. A world that is governed by these laws of science. These laws of science that every day we break them, we mold them, we use them, we shape them to do the amazing things we do in our industry. And bring that into your classrooms. Thank you very much, everyone.